Hi everyone, I'm Vassy Kapelos, host of Power and Politics here on CBC, and I'm with my esteemed colleague, CBC's polls analyst Éric Grenier, and we're here with 150 days. I'm so excited for each and every one of them, counting down until the big day, Election Day, in October of this year. And we thought it'd be really interesting to take a look at the polls so far. I mean, we have Éric on the show all the time because of his awesome poll tracker. Last night I was just out for dinner with someone who was raving about your poll tracker and how obsessed they were.
Good.
And I think it's, we talk about it all the time, where the parties stand, sort of the horse race, but there's a lot more to polling. And there are a lot of genuine questions out there, I think, about the validity of it, the accuracy of it. How much do we talk about it? How much do we depend on it? That kind of stuff. And I know that you're equipped to answer all those questions. So
right.
we have solicited, and we hope that you will keep sending your questions if you're watching us on YouTube or on Twitter or on Facebook. Send us your questions. We'll get to as many of them as possible. Éric will. He's much smarter than me. I'm just going to ask them. But I'll start off with some of the ones we had put up sort of a sticky on Instagram. And so we got a lot of great questions there. So I'm going to start with one from, and I'm going to probably butcher a lot of pronunciations. I'm going to preface this right now by saying that, so my apologies in advance. Anu Janaraja on Instagram asks, which cabinet ministers are at risk?
Okay, that's a good question because I saw that was coming up on the Instagram, so I did look a little bit to see which ones.
You cheated, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I did, yeah. So this one I'm a little bit prepared for. But there's a number of them that we'd probably highlight as being in danger. If we were going across the country, you'd look at someone like Carla Qualtrough in Delta. That's a riding that is the kind of riding in BC that flips around a lot, quite a bit. So she is someone who certainly can't take re-election for granted. Amarjeet Sohi in Edmonton Mill Woods, he's certainly going to be, he won, I think, by something like 57 votes in 2015.
Yeah, it was the tightest margin of any Liberal.
So, you know, that's going to be tough, especially in Alberta where the Liberals aren't doing very well in the polls. Going a bit to Ontario, someone like Karina Gould in Burlington, that's another one of those swing ridings in the GTA. That is one riding that the Conservatives would be looking to pick up and one that the Karina Gould will have to fight to hold on to.
She's Minister of Democratic Institutions.
That's
She's
right.
the one who's kind of responsible for all the stuff on social media companies right now, for example, or election interference.
Maryam Monsef, Peterborough-Kawartha, that is one of those classic bellwether ridings, right? Peterborough has a tendency of voting with whatever party forms the government. So if the Conservatives are going to win this election, Peterborough is one of those seats that might flip over.
She's Status of Women in International Development.
And Jean-Yves Duclos in Quebec. That is an area, he's for
families and social, not social services, I'm saying it wrong.
Social development.
Thank you, yeah.
There's a number of titles in there. But yeah, he's in the riding of Quebec. Quebec City is an area where the Conservatives are really looking to pick up some seats. One of the factors there will be Maxime Bernier and the People's Party. That's one of the areas where People's Party could actually do not too bad.
I'm glad you asked that because the same person asked a follow-up question. Where is the People's Party support coming from? Follow up, which province?
Well, if we look at the poll tracker right now where we have the People's Party, we only have them at about, yes, this is lovely.
I'll just point. I'll be Vanna to your
We
plan.
right now have them at 2% nationwide, and we really don't see much of a difference if we're going through province to province. So we can actually do this on the poll tracker. And you can see that if we're looking at a place like Quebec, the People's Party is only right now at, again, 2% support. We really see that pretty much everywhere that you're looking at, that they don't have that concentration of support right now. There's been one poll recently, had them a little bit higher in Alberta. They've had some better results in Atlantic Canada, but I think that might be a bleed over from the People's Alliance, which is a provincial party in New Brunswick, and some people might think they're the same party. So the problem for Maxime Bernier is that he doesn't yet have concentration of support anywhere. His own riding right now would be his best chance of winning in Beauce. Aside from that, it's really hard to find another riding where the People's Party would have enough support in one place to win a seat.
Okay, I have another great question from Instagram. J-2K, hope I'm saying that right, asks, how do you determine when to poll? Do you find a big shift when certain events occur? And use some examples from this year, for example.
Yeah, well, I don't do the polling myself, of course, but for the pollsters, it depends. Some of them, for example, Nanos puts out a poll every single week. So they're doing rolling polling every week. So that way, that's actually a good thing to do because you can track trends over time. You're not tied to when you're in the field, if it was just after a big news story. But you do see that pollsters who generally are now not being paid by media to do the polls, they're doing them themselves. in part as a promotional activity to get their company in the news. Often it's tied around an anniversary. We're seeing a lot of polls, for example, on the Ontario provincial situation because it's one year in about a week or so.
You'll be talking about that on the show this evening. Tune in 5 p.m.
And also when there's lots of things going on. We saw after the SNC-Lavalin affair, there was a lot of polling. In the last month, there actually hasn't been a lot, I guess because it seems like things are quieting down. I imagine, though, with the news we had this week from Jane Philpott and Jody Wilson-Raybould, probably see a couple polls relating to that.
Sammy Balak on Twitter, I'm glad you brought that up, Eric, asks, how much would it impact on, what kind of impact on the polls for Liberals and other parties might there be with this announcement that those two women, Jody Wilson-Raybould and Jane Philpott, will run as independents? And what do you think their chances are of winning?
I think that the impact will be very localized. They did talk a lot about almost running a national independent campaign, but we'll have to see some pickup on that. We have no indication that's going to happen just yet. But their two ridings, you would have to think about Jody Wilson-Raybould at having a much better chance because it was a three-way race. Let me pull up the map actually, and we can take a look at these ridings. If we're looking at Vancouver Granville. Now that's a riding where the NDP finished. It's just right here. That's a riding where the NDP finished with 27%. So it's not inconceivable to have someone finish in first place with just 30-33. The Liberal vote is split between Jody Wilson-Raybould and another candidate. I can actually highlight it on this thing. This is a fancy thing that I'm still getting a little bit used to, but Vancouver Granville. There you go. Actually, we can pull up the results from 2015.
Ooh, let's do that.
There you go. So you can see that she won by 9,000 votes. So if this amount of votes is
something like 43% of the vote, right?
Yeah. So if she had 24,000 votes, you can imagine that she could split that in half. And if the NDP goes down a little bit, then it's the kind of riding that maybe they could pick up.
Yeah.
But if we're looking at Markham-Stouffville, which is where Jane Philpott has her seat, that one is going to be a lot tougher for her to hold. It's just off to the corner right here. So it has a lot of rural areas just to the north of the GTA, but it is obviously a very GTA riding. And if we look at what happened in 2011, that was a seat that was won by the Conservatives. That was Paul Calandra's riding. So it flips back and forth. And in 2015,
he only lost by a huge amount, right?
Not a huge amount at all. And in 2015, the Jane Philpott and Paul Calandra took about 92% of the vote. So if you're looking at a split, it's likely going to be a split on the Liberal vote. You're not likely going to see a lot of Conservatives voting for Jane Philpott, who's talking a lot about that she believed in the Liberal platform and what they were doing, that she doesn't want to see Andrew Scheer become Prime Minister, that she wants to see action on climate change. I don't see a lot of Conservatives flocking.
And we know the Conservatives are focused on that area as a path to victory as well.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
they'll be focusing a lot of resources there on their own campaign.
When you look at this map, this is from 2011. This is when Stephen Harper won a majority government, lots of blue around the GTA, and then it flipped over in 2015, lots of red. So for the Conservatives to win a majority government, they need
those back.
Yeah, and Markham-Stouffville would be one of those.
Okay, I want to remind everybody who's watching us on YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook that you can send in your questions. I'm hearing from the control room that you're already sending in a ton of really great ones, so keep them coming. I'm going to ask one from Jamie Deslip on Facebook. Any chance of the NDP gaining ground, and if so, where?
Yeah, I say, well, there is that chance that the NDP gains ground. Let's go back to the poll tracker, actually, if we can do that. So yeah, the NDP right now, we have them at about 16% nationwide. So that's a drop of about 4 points from where they were in 2015. And they've dropped a lot in places like Quebec, in British Columbia, places where they actually have some seats. But if we're looking at where they're starting to do a little bit better and where they might have some chances, you'd look at a place like Ontario, where Liberals have taken a bit of a tumble. This is polling over the last few months. You see the Liberal numbers have actually dipped a little bit after the SNC-Lavalin affair. The Conservative numbers have held steady. They haven't picked up any support, but it's the NDP, who were somewhere around 15% in January, early February. They're now somewhere between 15 and 20%, which is generally where they are. That's their historical kind of average. Yeah, but it means that a lot of seats that the Liberals might have taken from the NDP, particularly in Toronto.
Not as certain of a thing.
Not as certain. You'd think of a seat here, like in Ottawa Centre, which was a very close contest between Catherine McKenna, the Environment Minister, and Paul Dewar, the late Paul Dewar. The NDP just won that seat very easily in the provincial election last year. It's the kind of seat that the NDP might be able to pick up. So outside of Quebec, because in Quebec, if we look at the numbers in Quebec for the NDP, really not good. They had 25% of the vote in 2015, and right now they're just at about 10%. Right now in the averages, they're 0.6 percentage points ahead of the Greens for fourth place. So Quebec going to be tough unless they can turn that around.
Okay, follow-up question on something that you, as I mentioned, will be talking about on the show, and that is what's happening in the 905 and the potential impact of Doug Ford. The question is from Alex Guibor. Is Doug Ford's unpopularity in Ontario, and that is, I mean, that's his assumption, but there are certain polls that I'm sure you can talk about lately that have shown there has been an impact of the decisions arising from the budget that was released last month. Is Doug Ford's unpopularity in Ontario hurting Andrew Scheer's chances at winning government?
Yeah, well, I wrote about that this morning in my piece.
Excellent column today, Eric.
I can just pull from that. But yeah, there was some polling that was done just recently. It had very low levels of popularity for Doug Ford, about 30% approval, disapproval somewhere around 64, 75%. Those are the kind of numbers that Kathleen Wynne had when she was going towards her defeat in 2018. So those aren't very good numbers for the PCs. A couple of the polls also had them behind either the NDP or the Liberals in voting intentions. I think that we are seeing a bit of a problem for Andrew Scheer because when you're looking at the kind of numbers in this chart that show that the Conservative line has been holding steady, if not a little bit down from where they were in January and February, you wonder why aren't the Conservatives able to make any ground up in Ontario when they've made big gains in Atlantic Canada, they're up in Quebec, they're up in parts of the West. So the fact that they're not able to make these gains in Ontario, and when you see this kind of really very high unpopularity for Doug Ford in the PCs just 1 year after they come into power, it's hard to separate the two.
It will also be interesting to see if the decision a few days ago to reverse those cuts will have, I mean, that's not all the cuts. These are the ones that affect municipalities. I wonder if that will sort of blunt the bleeding for now, and whether that, because we're still 5 months out. Well, it'd be interesting to see.
And maybe it takes away an argument from the Liberals that the PCs are making lots of cuts, and that's the kind of thing you'll see from a Andrew Scheer government. But I think a lot of people, I don't know how much credit politicians get for going back on something that they've went forward with. That's a good question. I don't know. I don't know if people...
That's a good question.
I don't know if they give them credit for that.
Okay, we have a couple questions on the Green Party, starting with Speller_007. Will the Green Party make party status, and which province will they acquire the most seats in? And prompted by asking about whether that's BC, which is the conventional guess.
Yeah, well, they are right now nationwide. We have them at a very high level of support for the Greens. We have them at just under 10%. The last time we had them anywhere near that in the polls would have been before the 2011 election. When the majority government that Stephen Harper won, it transformed things. The NDP took a lot of that Green vote away. So the fact that we're seeing the Greens so high does put them in range of some seats. Now we have them winning 4 seats right now, all of them in BC, and all of them on Vancouver Island. So you're talking about Nanaimo Ladysmith, which they just won in a by-election. You're looking at Saanich Gulf Islands, which is Elizabeth May's seat. But then you're also thinking about a seat like Victoria, Esquimalt, Saanich-Sooke. These are also Vancouver Island seats. Give them a chance, but we have them topping out at as many as 10 seats. So that is still below the 12 they need for official party status. So it's hard to see them getting to 12 because you can give them maybe another seat or two in Vancouver Island or in BC as a whole on Vancouver Island. You can maybe see them winning a seat like Guelph in Ontario, where Mike Schreiner won in the provincial election. Right. Maybe Fredericton in New Brunswick, maybe a seat or two in Prince Edward Island, where they just had some breakthroughs there. But it's hard to see them getting to 12. They would need to have a big breakthrough in Quebec. They would need to win some of the seats in the Georgian Bay area, where they've had some success in the past. But clearly BC is going to be the key to any breakthrough for them. Right now in the polls, we have them at about 15% and only about 6 points behind the NDP for that fourth place.
How significant is that?
I think that's pretty significant because they only took around 8% of the vote in BC in 2015. So nearly doubling their support there moves them in range of a lot of seats on Vancouver Island. And another place where they might do well is, of course, in Atlantic Canada, those provincial breakthroughs. And if you're looking at where they are in the polls now, have them at 14%, which is the only other place where they're polling in double digits. And it's one of the places where they're just behind the NDP. The NDP right now in Atlantic Canada, 15%. The Greens at 14%. I would not be surprised to see the Greens finish third in Atlantic Canada. Just a question of whether they can turn that into any seats.
Right, which is always the question that they have. Okay, let's talk a little bit about logistics, because there's some really interesting questions here. Different kinds of polling. Malicious Sheep 56. Sounds like a scary name, but on Instagram asks, different kinds of polling, example, phone, text, email, banner ad on the street, and the effectiveness of each. Can you talk a little bit about what the big pollsters use right now and what you imagine they'll be using in the lead up to the election and how that might affect the reliability and the outcomes?
Well, the way polls used to be done, which was over the telephone with live callers, so actual people on the phone dialing people randomly.
Who even talks on the phone anymore?
Exactly, and it would be landlines. Yeah, telephone pollsters now, they do call cell phones. This is one of those myths that they only call landlines. It's not the case anymore. Pollsters include a lot of cell phones. Some even include mostly cell phones, which is a bit tougher. It's harder to get people to pick up a number that they don't know who it is.
I
it's
would
an
never
unknown
do
number.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That's why response rates are very low, 1 in 10 or lower. So
really?
Yeah, you got to call a lot of people just to get some responses. So there are still some pollsters who do that. Nanos Research does that. Most are now moving online, so they do that. They have an online panel. Now, the panel is usually tens or hundreds of thousands of people that they recruit in various ways. They can recruit them online through ads, for example. They can recruit them by phoning them up and asking them to join the panel. So we see a lot of online polls. We also see IVR, which are the robo polls, the polling where it's an automated caller and you punch in 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever, to your response. The advantage to that is that you can call a lot of people very quickly, get a big sample. The problem is that response rates can sometimes be very low, the single digits. I've seen 2, 3%. So that means that you need to call, to get one person, you need to call maybe 50, 100 people just to get one person to respond. So in terms of the reliability, they all have some blind spots. Online tends to have a bit more trouble reaching, say, for example, older people. Maybe you're getting people that are a bit more engaged because they're part of this panel, they're taking part in the poll. IVR, they have a lot of trouble getting young people. And with telephone polling, it's just that they have a lot of trouble getting a lot of people because it costs a lot of money, takes a lot of time. So
Sounds like it's hard all around.
it is very hard, yeah. But one of the things that people have the perception the polls are getting worse. There's actually been some studies that have been done recently showing that if you're looking at over the last 80 years or so that polling's been done, the polling's about as good as it's ever been. Just that we all focus on when they get it wrong and not when they get it right.
And I think, the media has, I often talk about this, the media has a role as well, right? Like we've learned a lot of lessons throughout various elections that we've covered completely wrong too, right? It's the way in which you sort of describe, like polls are a measure of a time, a specific moment in time, a measure of sentiment. But people can always change their minds when they go in the ballot box. And there's almost like a different calculation that goes on for a lot of people. So it gives us a sense of where the electorate is going, what they're feeling at certain moments of a campaign or prior to one. But it's really hard to predict what people are going to do when they step into a ballot box.
And whether they will step into the ballot box.
Yes,
that's the biggest issue.
That's very true as
Often when the polls have been wrong, it's because they weren't able to gauge who was actually going to show up.
Right.
How many people were they polling that said they were going to vote for this or that party, and then they just don't show up.
Yeah.
And it benefits one party
And it's
over
kind of
another.
incumbent, I think, on us to explain that as we report on polls as well. So we'll be aiming to do that in the election.
Right.
Okay, there's a couple kind of horse race questions, and I want to get to those. Michael Shaw on YouTube asks, where have the Liberals lost most of their support from? And conversely, someone else asks, as soon as I find it, Sean Anigan asks, which party do you think has the best chance of beating the Conservatives?
Okay,
So
well,
let's talk about their weak points, basically.
right, yeah. Well, if we're just talking about which party has the best chance to beat the Conservatives, if we're just looking at the numbers right now, the Conservatives are at 36%.
Even I can do that math.
The Liberal number is bigger than the NDP number right now. So right now you would say they would have the best chance, but as we saw in 2011, the party that's in second place doesn't always end up in second place
Everything
or in
changed,
first,
yeah.
right, at the end of it. So where they've lost a lot of support, they've lost support everywhere. The Liberals are down in every part of the country. There's two areas that I'd highlight, though. Atlantic Canada is one of them. You can see in this chart, and if you're listening to this, I can tell you that it's going down for the Liberals. They started the year at about 50% in Atlantic Canada. Now they're somewhere around 35%, so they dropped a lot of support there. The Conservatives were about 25 points back. Now they're about 2 or 3 points back. So that's a big change, and it flips a lot of seats. Actually, I'll show you on the map. Let's flip to the map again. Just because we have this toy, I want to use it.
While Eric's doing that, keep sending us your questions. We're getting lots of them, and we want to keep answering them.
Yeah, so let's look at Atlantic Canada. All right, so the results in 2015 were pretty unanimous, all red in Atlantic Canada. But if you're looking at where things
And if you
were,
recall that night, just a little trip down memory lane, we were all standing by, as those results came in, it was like, will Trudeau win? What's going to happen in this election? As soon as this happened, it was like pretty much over.
Yeah, bam.
Oh, okay, it's done,
Yeah, because there are a few seats, particularly
conclusive.
in southwestern New Brunswick, we
Yes.
thought Conservatives, no chance that they will lose these, and they lost them.
Yeah.
So yeah, you're looking at the map, it was all red in 2015, but if you look at 2011, a lot of blue. The Conservatives won a lot of the seats in New Brunswick. They won some seats in Nova Scotia. They had a seat in PEI. They also had a seat in Newfoundland and Labrador. So this is the kind of map that we might see in this election if the numbers stay the way that they are, that the Conservatives can win back some seats in New Brunswick, where they won the provincial election. They can win some of the rural seats in Nova Scotia, and that Newfoundland might not be all red. Jack Harris just announced that he's running for the nomination for the NDP in St. John's East, trying to get back into it. So we'll see.
Okay, and so that was the Liberals, right?
Yeah.
Let's talk about Conservatives.
For the Conservatives, I mean, their biggest hope is to make some gains in the GTA in Quebec. Quebec is one of the areas they're really targeting. Right now, they're polling somewhere around 20%, and they have a chance to pick up some seats. When you think about 2011, they only won 5 seats in Quebec. They didn't need a single seat to win a majority government. Not probably going to be the same case for Andrew Scheer. They want to win 15, 20 seats in Quebec. So if we're looking at the Quebec map, I mean, their big focus will be in Quebec City, where they already hold most of the seats, but there are 2 Liberal seats in Quebec City that they're going to be trying to pick up. Louis Hébert in Quebec, that's Jean-Yves Duclos and Joël Lightbound, who's Parlsec, I think for the Finance Minister?
Finance Minister, that's Yeah,
but they'll also be looking at a place like Central Quebec. We're expecting to hear, unless, if I'm not mistaken, it might have already happened, but in a seat, Trois-Rivières, which is right
I don't think it happened yet, but we kind of, everyone said knows who it is.
Yeah. That Yves Lévesque, who is the former mayor of Trois-Rivières, he's going to be running for the Conservatives in that riding. That gives them a good chance to pick up an NDP seat, where the NDP is going to be struggling to win anything in Quebec. They're going to be trying to win a lot of those seats outside of Quebec City, but also between Montreal and Quebec City. They have some ambitions for winning in and around Montreal. We're going to have to wait and see if they can actually do that. Conservatives haven't had a lot of luck. You can see on the map, not a single dark blue around Montreal, and you have to go back to the Brian Mulroney years to find one.
And that's a ways back. Okay, Daniel Burke on Facebook asks, I love this question, do campaigns matter? What were the parties polling at the beginning of the 2015 campaign versus the election results? Because there was a big, I mean, it was a long campaign, but there was a big difference.
The campaigns absolutely matter. If we think about where things were at the beginning of the campaign, beginning of August in 2015, the New Democrats were leading in the polls, the Conservatives were in second place, the Liberals were in third. And obviously it flipped. By the midpoint of the campaign, it was an actual 3-way race. I remember seeing polls around the beginning of September had 31, 31, 31.
Yes, I remember.
For all so which would have been a nightmare for me on election night to try to get any idea.
Your nightmare, my dream come true,
And so, that campaign mattered a lot. But
78 days they're telling me it was.
Yeah, that was a long campaign.
Yeah, felt like forever.
Yeah, but
this one will not be that long.
No, although it'll still be. We'll see. If it calls around September 1st, which is the earliest it can be called, still be about 50 days.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
But think about the provincial campaigns in New Brunswick. The Liberals were leading, pretty big margin. In the end, the Greens make this breakthrough. The People's Alliance. Think about Quebec, where Québec solidaire started as just a marginal party trying to win maybe a 4th seat. Instead, they win 10. And the Parti québécois completely collapses. Even in Ontario, at the beginning of the campaign in 2018, the New Democrats and the Liberals were neck and neck in the polls. By the end of it, the Liberals have their worst result ever. The NDP just short of their victory in 1990 in terms of historical results. So
the outlier there being Alberta, where since the second that party amalgamated, they basically kept 11 polls and did exactly that in the election.
Which actually is a good caution, right? Because people say, well, the campaign started this way, and look, campaigns matter where the polls are at the beginning of the campaign don't matter. Things will change. Not always. Sometimes they don't change.
You never know, right?
Yeah. So maybe things will change in this campaign. Maybe they won't.
Okay. This is a very tough accountability question for you, Éric. Okay. Jason Kablowski on Twitter asks, is CBC Polls Tracker an accurate snapshot of public opinion? Hard question.
Well, it's an accurate snapshot, I will say this, of where the polls are, and it's up to the polls to actually be an accurate representation of where things will be on election day. But that's a really good question, because we see that on a number of campaigns where by the end of it, we have a decent idea of what's going to end up being the result, but in the end, we still see some surprises. We knew Jason Kenney. We virtually knew that Jason Kenney was going to be the next Premier of Alberta. We didn't know he was going to win by as much as he did. We knew Doug Ford was in a really good spot to win a majority government. Didn't know if he'd win by the margin that he did. So there's always that possibility. So one of the things that we've tried to do with this is to give people an idea of what we don't know. So if you look at the seat projection chart right now, we have it 160 for the Conservatives, 129 for the Liberals, but we also have these very big error bars that show for the Liberals between 71 and 183 seats. For the Conservatives, 121 to 208. Now, we're not saying that it's equally likely that they'll end up at either of those polls, but we want to give people an idea that where the polls are suggests that this is the kind of thing that could happen on Election Day if we're taking into account how polls can be off, how the model can be off, how people can
so you tried to build that into your model, like you try to take that all into account.
Yeah, so like, you know, you have the Conservatives up by 6 points. If they win by 6 points, they'll almost certainly win the election. But we still, taking into account the way that polls have been off in the past, we're still projecting, for example, right now, that if there was an election today, it's more or less a toss-up whether the Conservatives would win a majority or a minority.
So was my next question, chances of a minority.
Well, you can see it right here. We have 34% that there would be a chance that the Conservatives would win the most seats, but not a majority. 21% chance that the Liberals would win the most seats, but not a majority. So you're looking at somewhere around a 55%.
What was this number prior to SNC?
For the Liberals winning a majority, it's 8% right now. Back before then, it was well over 50%. They were in a position to win a majority government. It was somewhere around, I think, that they'd win the most seats was about 70-80% for the Liberals. Now they're just under 1 in 3 seats.
And how long has it been stuck around this point? Because a lot of times you've, for example, through your poll tracker, we've seen, like after the India trip, it goes down, but then it comes back up. I know that you've said that this is being more sustained, but how sustained has it been?
Well, we can actually, you can see that it's been since then that the Conservatives have been favored to win the most seats. It was around the end of February that we projected that the probability of, if an election were held today, that the Conservatives would win the most seats. It's been holding since then. But so it's really been stable for a long time, which is actually kind of surprising. If you look at where things were from the last election, the Liberals were given pretty much an absolute chance of winning an election up until mid-2017. Then Andrew Scheer became the leader. More people started going to the Conservatives because they had a leader in place. And during the India trip, there was this brief moment when things were looking like they were close again. But it's been ever since the beginning of February that the Conservatives have been in the better position to win an election if we're held today.
Okay, we've done a half hour, but we still have a lot of questions coming in, so we'll take a few more if we can borrow a few more minutes of your time, Éric. Thank you so much. Okay, let me pull up another question here. I'm trying to think of which ones I haven't asked. Sorry, my apologies. Looking at too many things. Do we know, Chad Hudson IG says, do we know the second choice of likely NDP Green voters for strategic voting possibilities? And can you talk a bit about strategic voting and potential impact of that?
Sure. There has been a polling that was done by Abacus Data just recently. Was showing what people who are more on the fence and whether they would go to another party. For the Liberals, it was primarily the New Democrats that would be people's second choice. For the NDP, it was split between the Liberals and the Greens. And for the Greens, it was primarily the NDP, but also the Liberals. So it's more or less that those three parties are all fishing in the same pond. There are some New Democrats who would prefer going to the Conservatives over the Liberals. There are some Greens who would do the same thing. And you do see some Liberals as well who prefer the Conservatives or the NDP. But it's primarily those three parties, which I think is a bit different than where things used to be. If you go back maybe 5-10 years ago, I think there were a lot more Liberals that considered the Conservatives as their second choice. Now it's much more of a polarized landscape where I think a lot of the fence sitters are now with the Conservatives, so there's not a lot of blue Liberals right now supporting the party. But that's certainly been a change. And whether the strategic voting, I think it'll be definitely a big theme in the campaign because for the Liberals, if they're still trailing in the polls by Election Day, it'll be one of their arguments that they're going to be using. They're going to be saying, if you care about the environment, if you care about reconciliation with the Indigenous peoples, you have to vote for a Liberal. You can't waste your vote in an NDP or a Green. The question is whether it's still going to be an effective argument because we're seeing the Greens are now starting to actually win seats. And for them to be able to say, look at these examples, Nanaimo Ladysmith, New Brunswick, PEI, you don't have to vote strategically. And if you do vote strategically, maybe the Greens are the best choice in some ridings. The NDP are going to make that argument as well.
And I think also the difference is that they were running on campaign promises, right? So, for example, on environmental protection, here's what we are going to do, here's how serious we will be about it. Now they're running on their record, so they have to balance that promise with buying the pipeline, which a lot of people are upset about. Or we'll see what happens to Bill C-69, which is what they're trying to overhaul the pipeline approval process with. That was supposed to be, help enforcing more environmental protection and getting more voices involved in the process, and C-48, the tanker ban, which now parts of the Senate are looking like they might kill. So there's a lot of sort of questions that they'll have to answer for that might
Electoral reform?
Electoral reform is a big one.
Particularly for strategic voters, you would think,
right.
if that would be one of those issues for them as well.
Yeah, so we'll see how effective the argument is, but I can imagine they'll be making it again. Let's talk a bit about Quebec, because we've gotten a few questions about that. Devin DeMarco on YouTube asks, how likely is it for the Bloc to regain party status, and at whose expense?
Right now, they actually have a pretty good chance.
Yeah.
They don't have, they're
too shy of it? Yeah, okay.
They have 10 seats right now. Right now, they'd have a pretty good chance, actually, of doing it, because we have them projected to win in Quebec, the Bloc Québécois, just about between 3 and 33 seats, because there's a lot of four-way races.
It's a wide range.
Yeah, it is a wide range, because there's a lot of four-way races, so you could see the Bloc.
Quebec will be exciting.
It'll be very exciting, yeah, because you could see the Bloc winning a seat. You could see any party winning a seat with 28% of the vote.
Wow.
And so that means that anybody can win that kind of seat.
Anybody's game, yeah.
So the Bloc is in a much better position to win seats, but primarily because the Liberals have dropped and the New Democrats have dropped, because in a lot of those races where the Bloc finished second or a decent third, it was behind the Liberals or the NDP, because if you're looking at where the polls are, the Bloc is not really actually much better off than it was in 2015. We have them right now at 19.7% in Quebec. They had 19.3% in 2015. So they haven't actually made up any ground in terms of their support. But because the Liberals have come down, it means that they almost by default move ahead.
Is that I mean, they know they have a new leader. They had dipped very, very far in the polls. Have they come up from their low point, or has it been kind of steady?
They have come up,
Oh.
yeah. If we're at the lowest point when 70% of the caucus left under Martine Ouellette, the party dropped down to about 12% support in Quebec, and that would have just been a wipeout. They wouldn't have won a single seat. So they have actually improved since Yves-François Blanchet became leader. We'll see if he's a bit better known. He had a media personality because he was a commentator on Radio-Canada. French language debate would be a big opportunity for him, a big chance for him to make some gains. We'll see if they can do a lot better and do better than they did, not only in the seat count but in the vote. If their vote drops but they still pick up some seats, because of how the map is divided, it's a win in a weird way. Sort of like it was in 2015. Their vote dropped, but they actually gained seats from the last election.
A win in a weird way. I like that slogan. We can start using that soon. Devin DeMarco on YouTube asks, if the PPC could win more than one seat, where would it be?
I have no idea. That's no clue.
Who knows?
No clue. They could. I would say maybe Quebec City.
Right.
I've seen some polling putting them somewhere in the low double digits, so 10, 15%. So that means maybe in one of the seats, if they get a decent candidate, they could squeak by in a four-way race. That right now, I think, would be their best chance, but I don't think they're anywhere close to that just yet.
Okay. History question for you.
Great.
Gary Aduna. Only you can be enthused about that. Gary Aduna on Facebook, I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, asks, how many times has a first-time government been defeated after only one term federally?
Well, the last time it happened was, it depends on how you're defining this. So in 1980, Pierre Trudeau returned to power, and John Turner, who took over, he was defeated in 1984, but Pierre Trudeau was a returning prime minister. There was Joe Clark in 1979, who won a minority government, and he was defeated in 1980. But the last case you're looking at that's similar to this one, where it's a majority government coming in with a majority new prime minister, you're going back to R.B. Bennett in 1930, the Conservatives, he won. Depression had a bit of an issue with that, and he was defeated in 1935. And that was the last time. The only other time was Alexander Mackenzie, 1874 to 1878, one-term prime minister.
So it would be a big deal.
Yes, it would be very unusual.
Unique.
Yeah, we don't see it a lot, although we've been seeing it a lot provincially now. There were some provinces, New Brunswick, for example, never had one-term prime minister, premiers.
And
now they've had 3 in a row.
Right.
So.
Yeah. That's interesting. Philip Fox on Facebook asks, will the left of center parties split the vote and form a coalition? So
that'll be up to them.
I think, that'll depend on what the outcome is.
Yeah.
But what about that idea of vote splitting? Is it dependent on riding? Is it, what are the factors that go into whether or not that's a threat?
Yeah, I think that is something that happens. And I mean, it is a cynical way to think about politics, but with the system we have, it's just the way it is, right? Sometimes people vote for a party that they want more than they want the other party not to get in, right? So people have to choose for their second choice. There'll be some ridings in various parts of the country where it's better to vote for example, if you're on that side of the spectrum, the NDP over the Liberals, and some it'll be the Greens over the Liberals, and some it'll be the Liberals over the other parties. But the idea of a coalition, just to think a little bit about it. Right now in the projection, we have the Conservatives at 160. So they're short of a majority government. But right now, in order for the other parties to form a minority government on their own, or a majority government on their own, which is what Elizabeth May was suggesting Justin Trudeau should do, even if he doesn't win the most seats, right now they would need the bloc to get to a majority.
Well, she was answering a question. She would contend she didn't suggest it. She was just saying that's what they have a right to do.
Right, okay.
Just to provide both sides there.
Sure.
Yeah.
Although I think that she would probably be okay with that. But yeah, right now those other parties would need the bloc. They're not close enough, just the Liberals, the NDP, and the Greens, to get to 170 seats. If you remember what happened in 2008, getting the bloc into a coalition is a good way to make sure that doesn't work out very well in public opinion.
All right. Okay, I'm going to wrap it there. Thank you, Eric. And thank you guys so much for sending in your questions. We hope to do this again before the election. And as always, you can tweet either of us with any of your questions throughout the rest of the day, the week, the month, or the 150 days until the election. Thanks a lot, guys.